I want to say, I want to have very strong words for this, but I want to try to be diplomatic. Look, I think that was a massive win for Vladimir Putin because, and there really was no decisive breakthrough there. It's unclear to me what the United States achieved from that. I don't think we walked away with anything from that, really. The supposedly the big crown achievement of what the U.S. got from that was the Russians willing to make concessions on their war and their willingness to allow Ukraine to receive Article 5 life security guarantees. But then just yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry very forcefully asserted that they are opposed to there being any uh, NATO member states to deploy military contingents to Ukraine. And I would argue that without any such deployments, you don't have an Article 5 like security guarantee, or if you want to call it that on paper, it's not credible. And the Ukrainians arguably already had that in the form of the Budapest Memorandum. So what distinguishes that from the Article 5 like guarantees, I don't know. But Putin got his handshake with Trump. He successfully evaded the deadline for the sanctions, the secondary sanctions on the purchases of Russian oil, which President Trump had been threatening.
Yeah, and they seem to have disappeared as well. President Trump hasn't mentioned them again and talked of bringing them in.
Correct. That appears to be the case for now. The U.S. Senate, on the other hand, they are gung ho and ready to slap down the sanctions if the talks fail and the negotiations break. But as far as the administration is concerned, we're currently in negotiations mode, and so it would not be constructive to do that this time. But yes, I agree. That was a big win for Putin. He managed to undo some of the geopolitical isolation that the international community had been doing to Putin for his war crimes and other various crimes against humanity. And so for those reasons, and the Russians, they stalled and they bought time. So we're now going to have to rediscover the obvious, which is the Russians, for the most part, are not willing to make any sort of meaningful concessions. And they got an opportunity to whisper to the president's ear about how it's okay if you cede Donetsk Oblast for a ceasefire, not for conflict termination, but for a ceasefire, we can then negotiate conflict termination. And that appears to be the big concession that we are trying to have the Ukrainians make to facilitate the conflict termination agreement. So these are, a lot of Russian wins. It's unclear to me exactly what we achieved in doing other than nominally resuming talks with the Russians so that they can then make unilateral demands where we make all the concessions and then they make zero concessions. But here we are now.
Well, it's interesting. UK Defence Intelligence this week, just before the meeting between the European leaders and with Keir Starmer from the UK and President Trump and President Zelensky in the White House, put out a little study where they'd analysed the length of time it had taken the Russians to capture the territory in Donetsk that they have at the moment, extrapolated that and extrapolated the casualties to see how long it would take them to take the rest of Donetsk. They calculated about another 4 years and about another 1.9 million casualties. So there's no wonder Vladimir Putin is trying to get that written into any peace agreement, because he hasn't got another 4 years and 1.9 million people's worth of goodwill amongst the Russian people, I think.
No, exactly. And it was unfortunate to see President Trump walk away from the meeting on Friday, apparently seemingly convinced by from his own statements that the Russians are going to seize all Donetsk anyway pretty soon. So why not just therefore save us the trouble and negotiate it away? Completely agree with that assessment from the UK intelligence, by the way. In our assessment, it'll be a multi-year undertaking to seize all of Donetsk Oblast because of the terrain that they have to fight through, the fortress cities they have to fight through. If you're interested, we did our own geospatial analysis to look at it as well, and I can share our numbers, which are probably less sophisticated than what the MOD provided, but there was a recent American intelligence leak that supposedly the Russians would seize Donetsk by October of this year. And I must say, strongly disagree with that assessment, or at least I think it's being misreported. I think that was the most dangerous course of action, sort of the high water mark in terms of the forecast cone. And of course, there's going to be the most likely course of action, for the audience's awareness when you do an intelligence product as an intelligence professional. You warn the policymaker about, hey, here's the grand scope of things you have to worry about. Worst case scenario, which is definitionally very unlikely, versus here what we think is going to happen. And I suspect the worst case scenario was that October number that's being quoted everywhere, but that is definitionally the absolute worst case scenario is not likely to happen. It will be a multi-year undertaking.
Yeah, worst case, best case, most likely is what we bring in from a planning perspective, and then the reality is usually something completely different, and that's the realms of an intelligence officer and a planning officer, because I've done both. But Alaska, the telling bit for me was Donald Trump's body language whenever he shook the hands of Vladimir Putin, first of all, and then you get the B-2 bomber with the was it F-22s or F-35s flying overhead as they walk past the F-22s, and then the difference in the body language between the handshake at the press conference after they'd had the negotiations. Putin's body language didn't change. Donald Trump clearly was feeling slightly bruised, was my reading of what had happened. Of course, we don't know what happened behind closed doors. But do you think that translated into Donald Trump and his behavior then in the Oval Office whenever Zelensky came in with the European leaders and Keir Starmer of the UK and Ursula von der Leyen from the EU and Mark Rutte from NATO, which was a big delegate supporting Zelensky? Did that help there not be another ambush in the Oval Office? Or do you think Donald Trump was feeling conciliatory anyway, feeling slightly bruised potentially after Alaska?
Look, I don't know what Donald Trump was thinking at Alaska. What I do know is that they did not have their planned celebratory luncheon that was supposed to happen. That didn't occur. And we do know that, I don't know this. I suspect Donald Trump is likely going to ultimately regret having met with Putin in Alaska, given that, again, I'm not sure exactly what that did for him, because I suspect that the negotiations are going to run into a stalemate, and we'll have more years of war fighting ahead of us. I think that's the most likely course of action. I think that when meeting with Zelensky just yesterday in the Oval Office with the European leaders, that went very well. I don't know if Donald Trump was looking to be conciliatory, but I think Donald Trump understands the reality that the likelihood of this failing dramatically and this being a tarnish on his legacy is quite high. He understands that if the Ukrainians don't receive robust security guarantees, then there is nothing that is going to have the Russians restart the war. That's why yesterday's discussion was so focused on what Ukrainian security guarantees look like and what the necessary Ukrainian concessions should be. So I think Trump understands that, and he understands that if he he will become the Neville Chamberlain of his times in the United States if this goes awry. So he's trying to avoid that. And the meeting went well. Zelensky didn't step on any landmines. It doesn't appear that anyone's put any landmines out for Zelensky to step on. The European leaders all spoke very eloquently and very well, and I think they're all on the same page. So I think the meeting went essentially as well as it could. And now, of course, we await to hear what concessions the Russians are willing to make. They have, of course, not mentioned any so far in the course of this war. If they do offer any real concessions, then that would be a massive inflection in the war. But we have to be really clear-eyed, because the Russians have floated ideas and various things which they present as putative concessions, but in fact are not concessions. For example, Steve Witkoff left the talks recently with the Russians, saying that the Russians promise that they're willing to, amend their constitution or change the legal basis to the promise they'll never attack Ukraine again. And that, of course, is not a real concession, because Vladimir Putin, after promising the Russian nation for decades he would never change the Russian constitution, changed the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to reset his term counter and then allow him to continue being Russian president of 2036. And so, the Russian constitution isn't really worth much. They changed.
Well, yeah, I think Steve Witkoff is the perfect example of why you should not use people who have got no diplomatic experience to carry out complex diplomatic tasks and everything else. But do you think Donald Trump has realized that the only deal he's going to get out of all of this, because he keeps talking about the deal, is the one that President Zelensky presented him with, which was $100 billion of US weapons to be bought using European and EU money. And that's the sort of deal that will keep Donald Trump on Ukrainian and Europe side, because Putin can't come up with the similar sorts of numbers. And as a sort of follow up, do you think that the proposal by Zelensky and Donald Trump that the next meeting will be a trilateral will ever happen?
So, reading the tea leaves of yesterday, Ushakov, the Russian presidential aide, made a statement, and there was a Kremlin statement, and notably, Trump's there was a great divide between the American readout of the conversation and what events were to follow, and the Kremlin readout from Ushakov. So Donald Trump's Truth Social statement mentioned that they're going to have a trilateral and they're going to work to try to do that. The Russian statement discusses how the Russian side and the Russian delegation is prepared to talk with the Ukrainian delegation, but made no mention of it being a presidential level, and it made no mention of a trilateral. So there appears to be a disconnect. Now, this could be ameliorated, of course, through more talking and massaging, but that immediate disconnect seemed quite striking. So I remain skeptical that President Trump and President Putin, or pardon me, President Trump and President Putin and President Zelensky will actually have a bilateral, because of course Putin has been decrying every Ukrainian president since Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in 2014 as illegitimate. And I think the likelihood of a trilateral is quite low as well. But again, a trilateral or a bilateral in order to do what? In order for the Russians to keep stonewalling. So oftentimes I feel like these meetings are sort of presented as a means into themselves, and of course they're meant to facilitate greater things. And without the Russians actually, changing, that's important. And most importantly, the logic is completely messed up here, because the Russians right now at the tactical level of war are winning, as we know. They're winning tactically. Without a more cogent Ukrainian theory of victory, they will win strategically if we draw this out in the long run, I think. And so for the side that has an actual theory of victory and that is winning tactically but not yet operationally, to then say, yeah, we're gonna stop the war, and we're gonna make a series of concessions, and we're gonna allow the Ukrainian side to have security guarantees. That's sort of antithetical to principles of strategy. In order to make the Russians actually get to that point, you have to make them lose. You have to impose defeats on them. You have to make them stop winning at the tactical level. Ideally, you have to start losing at the tactical level, so they actually do make concessions. And I would think in the terms of statecraft that that's a prerequisite for having these successful negotiations. But it appears to be me that we're attempting to achieve these goals without imposing those prerequisites.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.